think I'm good. Terrific. Welcome back. I'm here to moderate. I'm Diane Whitmore-Schanzbach. I'm the director of the Hamilton Project, and I'm here to moderate our second panel. It's the discussion on policy options for strengthening SNAP and TANF. We have a terrific panel here today. Per Hamilton Project style, I won't read in great detail all of the bios. Those are in your program, but I'll just briefly introduce everyone, starting on the end with Congressman Jim McGovern, who represents the 2nd District of Massachusetts. He's been served in Congress for over 20 years. He's tireless in his work for the poor, for example, as the co-chair of the Congressional Hunger Caucus. Next to the congressman is Bob Greenstein. He's the president of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and he's a widely regarded expert on the federal budget and a range of domestic policy issues, especially relating to poverty. Next to Bob is Sheldon Danziger. Sheldon is the president of the Russell Sage Foundation, and he's a professor emeritus from the University of Michigan, where he had an extremely distinguished career in studying poverty. Next to Sheldon is Hillary Hoynes. She's the Haas Chair in Economic Disparities at the University of California at Berkeley, and is one of our proposal authors today. And then next to me is Jim Ziliak. He's the Gatton Chair and the founding director of the Center for Policy Research at the University of Kentucky. To start off, I'll introduce our two authors, or I'll invite them to go up to the podium to give a brief overview of their policy proposals. So Hillary.
Thanks, Diane. I'm here to talk about a policy proposal with my collaborator, Miriam Bittler, who is also here today. From its introduction in 1935 and up through the mid-1990s, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, or AFDC, was a central feature of the social safety net, providing cash benefits to low-income families with children. It's now been almost 20 years, come the end of this summer, since federal welfare reform, beginning with state waivers and culminating in the federal welfare policy passed in August of 1996. So where we sit today is our proposal in evaluating and considering where the TANF program, which is now what AFDC has been converted into, and where that program sits today. So as a brief overview, the key features of that federal welfare reform legislation were, number one, a fixed nominal block grant in funding the program to the states. Requirements that individuals spend at most 5 years in a lifetime on the program, and many states implemented lifetime bans much, much lower than 5 years. Work requirements, financial sanctions for failing to adhere to work requirements, and a great deal of flexibility in setting eligibility and benefit rules, and as I'll talk about in just a minute, the utilization of how those dollars are spent in the state. So in the short term, what we saw and what there's much agreement on is that the period in the first 5 to 7 to 8 years after federal welfare reform legislation was a period of a strong labor market, the decline of welfare, the expansion of the earned income tax credit, and following that, an incredible increase in the employment rate of low education, low-skilled single mothers with children, and an increase in the well-being of those families. And what I want to talk about is what we've learned since then. So what we know from our evaluation of the last 15 to 20 years now, sitting from where we are in 2016, are 4 findings about the status of the program. The first finding is that TANF no longer acts as an automatic stabilizer. So we point out that prior to welfare reform, as you can see on this graph, TANF, or what was then AFDC, operated as a countercyclical program, rising in periods of declining employment and falling in periods of increases in employment. However, beginning in the early 2000s, that link very much severed, weakened and severed. And you can see very strikingly in the Great Recession, but beginning much earlier than that, in the early 2000s, as the number of single mothers who were not employed increased, the light green line, we saw not a response upwards, but instead a continuation of the decline in the welfare caseload through that period, and markedly through the Great Recession, with the massive increases in unemployment and declines, not increases, in the welfare caseload. So number one, the policy is no longer providing countercyclical or automatic stabilizer role. Number two, quite apart from the recession, more generally, TANF's reach has dramatically declined. So what you see in this graph here is that the effectiveness in the policy reaching needy families has declined dramatically. So on the eve of welfare reform in 1996, 72 out of every 100 families with children who were poor received cash assistance through AFDC. And that, as you can readily see on this graph, has steadily declined up until the point today, or in the most recent year of data. Only 26 out of every 100 poor families with children are receiving cash assistance through TANF. Number three, post-welfare reform, states have tremendous flexibility in how they spend their block grant from the federal government. They have flexibility in the programs and services that are utilized by those resources, and there's tremendous flexibility in which households receive the benefits of those services. And what we know from that is that a very small share, 25% of the federal block grant and the state spending, goes towards cash assistance, when this used to be virtually the entire use of the federal resources. And as you can see on this map, there's a dramatic amount of variation across states in that pattern. So the lightly colored states on the map are states that spend less than 10% of the TANF block grant on cash assistance, which we, those of us who have been studying these programs for a long time view as being the core source of use of this program. What is not clear here, but I'll just mention in passing, is it's also the case that the utilization of these services outside cash assistance moves much further up the income distribution than the sort of most disadvantaged that were the main recipients of the program prior to welfare reform. And then the fourth observation about the state of the TANF program today is a natural implication of a fixed nominal block grant, is that over time, the value of that block grant in real terms will decrease. And that decrease has been marked and at about a third of the value of the block grant today, as it was in 1996. And that's not accounting anyway for population growth, growth in the number of poor children, which is also going on in the background. So with that, I want to tell you briefly about our proposal that we'll continue to talk about when I get back to my seat. Number one, expand the reach of TANF by putting in requirements that states spend at least 25% of the block grant on cash assistance and at least 50% on what's called core services of cash, child care assistance, or work requirements. And requirements that this spending is limited to households with income not above 150% of poverty. Number two, we know very little, surprising little, about where these benefits of TANF are going in the income distribution. And so we introduced some accountability requirements to get better information from the states about what they're doing and where in the income distribution the benefits are going. Number three, make TANF more responsive to economic downturns through two sort of automatic policies. Number one, putting the work requirements, time limits, and the state work participation rate rules that they have to meet on hold during periods of economic downturn. And number two, building on the widely viewed as successful policies as part of the stimulus package, implement an automatic emergency fund to increase block grant spending during periods of economic downturn to facilitate a better automatic stabilizer role. And finally, to restore and preserve the value of the block grant. So I look forward to talking more after Jim's comments.
Good afternoon. There we are. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, is a cornerstone of food assistance in the U.S., serving 1 in 7 Americans in fiscal year 2015. The program provides monthly benefits to eligible households that are redeemable for purchases of foods that are to be prepared in the home. Research has shown that SNAP is a remarkably effective program at alleviating food insecurity among adults and children, at lifting families out of poverty, especially deep poverty, at improving health outcomes across the life course, and at smoothing consumption and income changes across the business cycle. Despite the success of SNAP, millions of Americans remain food insecure, some of whom face the double jeopardy of poverty and the attendant challenges it imposes on family life. Even those who are able to attain food security may not be able to attain and afford a diet that's appropriately nutritionally adequate. A key reason for these shortcomings is that the benefit level is insufficient because the maximum benefit amount is based on an increasingly unrealistic market basket of food. In response to this, today I'm proposing a three-pronged approach to modernize and strengthen the SNAP program by changing the way the SNAP benefits are established. The maximum SNAP benefit is anchored to the Thrifty Food Plan, or the TFP. The TFP is the lowest cost plan that the USDA designed to outline the types and quantities of foods and the attendant costs that people can purchase and consume at home in order to obtain a nutritious diet. It was first established in 1975 and most recently revised in 2006. As I outline in my proposal, there are 4 main challenges to the TFP as currently implemented. First, essential assumption of the TFP is that households have effectively unlimited time to prepare food at home. This follows from the fact that the TFP ignores the price of time in food production. In a seminal paper 50 years ago, Nobel laureate Gary Becker established the microeconomic foundations of household production, namely that the consumption of food entails both goods you purchase, such as vegetables, meat, and dairy, as well as time to shop, prepare, and clean up after meals. Just like the price of vegetables and meat at the grocery is not zero, the price of time spent in food preparation is also not zero. Thus, as the price of time goes up, households substitute away from more time-intensive food items to more expensive but more convenient food items. But the TFP shuts down the market of time and does not allow households to make that substitution. This assumption of time has no value this assumption that time has no value is increasingly disconnected from the changing norms in food production and, for that matter, with changes in family demographics and work expectations of recipients. The figure shows how women's time on meal preparation and cleanup has changed over time. Studies estimate that 13 to 16 hours per week are required to prepare meals in accordance with the 1999 TFP for the reference household of 4 persons, or roughly 2 hours per day. This is well outside the bounds of time spent in food preparation of nearly all households in modern American society, and as the figure suggests, was even outside the norm at the advent of the Economy Food Plan in the 1960s. Today, the typical non-working household spends 1 hour per day in food preparation, and working households about 30 minutes per day, including working households that receive SNAP. Although I believe the failure to account for the value of time is the greatest shortcoming of the TFP, there are several additional factors leading to the inadequacy of the SNAP benefit. These include, 1, the requirement of constant costs across TFP revisions, which implies that once food price inflation is accounted for, the real benefit today is the same as it was 40 years ago when the TFP was introduced. Two, the assumption that food prices are constant across the lower 48 states and the District of Columbia, which implies that the maximum benefit in Lexington, Kentucky, where I live, is the same as in Manhattan, defying evidence of substantive geographic variation in food prices. And third, the selection of a sample for measuring consumption and prices for input into the TFP. Currently, the TFP consumption profile is based on items consumed in a sample of low-income individuals with incomes less than 130% of the federal poverty line. This results in an overly disadvantaged sample and a bias towards too low of spending and thus too low of TFP benefits. So in response to these shortcomings, I propose a three-stage approach to reforming the TFP. The first stage is to introduce an immediate 20% adjustment for the value of time. Ignoring the cost of time artificially reduces the price of the TFP, and as a result, the TFP is inadequate to purchase and prepare its market basket for all but a small fraction of recipients. For a four-person household in fiscal year 2016, the maximum monthly benefit would increase from $649 per month to $779. Notably, this still places it 10% lower than the next highest plan produced by the USDA. The second stage of my proposal is to more comprehensively reform the TFP, that in addition to incorporating the time inflation factor, would relax the constant cost assumption. It would introduce geographic price adjustments, and it would change the reference consumption sample underpinning the TFP. The dietary guidelines direct consumers towards consumption of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, and lean meats and fish. Often these items are more expensive compared to more refined and processed foods, and in more limited supply for households residing in rural locations, as well as some of our urban communities. The constant cost assumption works at cross purposes to the general notion of updating the TFP using more recent spending patterns and dietary recommendations. The use of geographic price adjustment offers the opportunity to more accurately align benefits to the cost of food at the subnational level. And in the full proposal, I also suggest some additional changes to the process by which the TFP is calculated, especially how the reference sample is selected and the data source used for that sample. Related to this last reform, the current TFP reference household consists of a male and female between the ages of 19 and 50, and 2 children under the age of 12. As anyone who has shopped for a teenager knows, they eat like an adult and then some. So I recommend replacing one of the children with a teenage boy in the reference household unit. The new dietary guidelines for Americans were recently released, and this provides an ideal opportunity to comprehensively revisit the TFP. My proposal offers a roadmap on how to reform it, and doing so will enhance participants' ability to attain food security and to acquire a more nutritious and healthy diet for themselves and their families. Thank you.
We'll just get the final 2 folks mic'd here, and then we'll start the panel discussion. Thanks. That's terrific. Thank you both for those terrific presentations and the policy proposals that we've distributed today. I want to open up to the panel first, starting with Sheldon. Sheldon, give us a sense of the history. How do we get to this point with TANF? And could you just describe the shift in the program over the 20-plus years, going from an income support program to a work-based program?
Sure, and I think Hillary mentioned Act 1,
Yep.
The immediate post-1996 reform.
Those were good days.
Those were good days. So I go back a little earlier to the pre-96, and I can remember testifying before Senator Moynihan, thinking not that many people are going to go to work. And more people went to work than I thought. We did a study, and I used to tell my students, you know, if you're a serious researcher, when the research goes the other way, you have to call it. And so I think, and many others were surprised at how many people went to work. There was an emergence of what we call the disconnected, people with no work and no welfare. but they were relatively small. I think Becky Blank around that time had a proposal to deal with the disconnected temporary disability. But I think there was a lingering worry that welfare reform was so successful in the first act because the employment was so good. And I think, as the paper says, we're now in a world where unemployment has been high. We're also in a world, Larry Summers referred to this a little bit earlier, where there's a lot of concern about the driverless cars are going to disrupt taxi drivers and UPS drivers, et cetera. So we're in a world in which we have strong evidence that there are many people, not just TANF recipients or ex-TANF recipients, ex-offenders, people with long unemployment spells who are having a very hard time finding employment. So if I were to use a soundbite, it was the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. There was a lot of focus on personal responsibility, and we ought to put much more focus on work opportunity. And I would say, since I'm at Brookings, I was part of a AEI Brookings working group, which, I'll just read the quote because this was a bipartisan group, said, "We believe that the emergence of a work support system promoted by the '96 welfare reform law should be accompanied by public efforts to ensure that work is in fact widely available to all or nearly all low-income adults who want it." So the TANF Emergency Fund that Marianne and Hillary talk about in the paper is being expanded. I think one has to probably go beyond that and think about a whole range from public service employment to the kind of subsidies to private employers that were in the TANF Emergency Fund.
Bob, turning to you, there's been increasing policy interest in Congress on both TANF and on SNAP. And in fact, next month, the Republicans in the House are going to release their poverty blueprint. How do these proposals relate to the broader policy context?
So I think that's an interesting and important question. I urge everyone to read both of these papers, which are important not only for their proposals, but for the very good way in which they synthesize a lot of the research and evidence in the field. So we're entering into a debate where, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, the buzzword is evidence-based policy, and everybody says their policy is evidence-based. There's a lot of important evidence in these papers, and I hope it gets brought to bear in the debate we're heading into. I'm struck, Diane, by, in 4 areas, a big divergence between the evidence as presented in the papers and the proposals it leads the authors to, and some of the proposals we're expected to see next month when the poverty blueprint rolls out. So let me go through these 4 areas. Number 1, response to recession. The papers are very clear that SNAP responded robustly to the Great Recession and TANF barely responded at all. Yet the centerpiece of the proposal that is expected to come out next month, which builds on the Opportunity Grant proposal that Speaker Ryan unveiled in July 2014, under that proposal, SNAP in a number of states would be merged into a mega block grant with 10 other programs. The states participating would get a fixed amount of money for the year. It wouldn't alter as economic circumstances altered, so that whereas some of the recommendations in the Bitler and Hoynes paper go to how do we make TANF a little more like SNAP in responding, being more responsive to recessions, the proposal emerging on the Hill is how do we make SNAP more like TANF, and in this respect, it would make it less responsive to recessions. Second is the question of benefits and benefit levels. Jim's paper makes a strong case for a stronger, a larger SNAP benefit level. Now, if you think about it, what would happen to SNAP benefits if SNAP and 10 smaller programs, SNAP being by far the largest, were merged into one funding stream and made available to states? The Bitler and Hoynes paper notes, and Hillary just mentioned, that whereas pre-TANF, most of the money in AFDC went to benefits, today only 25% does. If money is put on the stump and can be used for a vast array of purposes by states, and the bulk of the money is SNAP money to start with, the overwhelming likelihood, following the TANF pattern, is that the total amount of money in food assistance would go down. Under the Opportunity Grant, one of the other merged programs is the Community Development Block Grant. A state or locality could take what had been SNAP dollars and use them to cut deals with real estate developers to do development projects in low-income areas. The likelihood is both that fewer people would get benefits and that the benefit levels would more likely go down than up. Item number 3, the safety net for the poorest families. So Bittler and Hoynes note that there was a dramatic decline in TANF's effectiveness as a safety net for the poorest people. That decline was just partially eased by SNAP, because if you have less income, your SNAP benefit is larger. If you make SNAP like TANF, you basically lose that effect, and rather than moderating some of the decline in TANF as a safety net for the poorest, you could in fact compound it. Now this leads me to a point I want to make. And it comes out of, in part, the Bittler and Hoynes paper. I often find myself in discussions where people say the poverty rate among female-headed families is lower today than it was pre-TANF. End of discussion. The program is simply a success, period. As the Bittler and Hoynes paper and much other research shows, you had some families, the more job-ready, who may have benefited from TANF. They may have been both prodded to go back into the labor market sooner, earned income credit supplemented their wages, and they rise above the poverty line. But since these people, those on TANF, were almost all below the poverty line to begin with, if you have another group farther down who becomes poorer, by definition, that doesn't increase the poverty rate. The poverty rate doesn't measure how far below the poverty line you are. You need a second measure. And Arlock Sherman at the Center on Budget in some new analysis finds that if he compares 1995 to 2005, before the economy began to go down, that the average income for the poorest tenth of female-headed families with children dropped $3,200, using a broad measure where we count SNAP and rental vouchers and so forth as income. And he also finds a substantial increase in the aggregate poverty gap for female-headed families from 95 to 05. So again, an important aspect of the Bittler and Hoynes paper is it doesn't sort of stop at looking at the poverty rate. It takes a fuller look at the effects on TANF. Last point, work. Jim can perhaps talk about this as well, but I find one of the first things I run into if I'm in a discussion on SNAP on the Hill, many people, particularly on the other side of the aisle from Jim, will tell you that the evidence is very strong that SNAP helps trap people in poverty and greatly discourage work. Reviewing the evidence, Jim writes in his paper, and I'm quoting, "There is little evidence that SNAP has substantial negative effects on other domains such as work effort." There's a big gap here between what people view as what the evidence shows. And it leads to my final comparison, which is really a striking comparison. So as many people in the room may know, under the SNAP program today, for people aged 18 to 50 not raising minor children, they are limited to SNAP for 3 months while unemployed out of every 3 years. If they try to find a job but can't, it doesn't matter. You're out after 3 months if you're unemployed. There are provisions to waive the 3-month limit in areas with high unemployment. The Bittler and Hoynes paper proposes that in TANF, where and when unemployment is high, TANF time limits and work requirements be suspended using the same mechanisms for which this 3-month time limit is suspended in SNAP. The operative provision on the Hill from House Republicans is precisely the reverse. It is to make SNAP like TANF and to completely eliminate all waivers and apply the 3 months time limit even in areas where the unemployment rate may be at double-digit levels. So I'm just struck by the sharpness of this contrast, and I'll end with where I started, which is my hope that these two papers will be read on the Hill by people on both sides of the aisle, and that they will study carefully not only their proposals, but their discussion of the research literature and what it shows.
Thanks. And finally to you, Congressman. The House Agriculture Committee has been holding a series of hearings on the past, present, and future of SNAP. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've learned?
Well, I've learned that I'm right, and the Republicans are wrong on this. Bob has testified, Jim has testified. We have had 14 hearings, a complete, top to bottom review of the entire program. And every hearing basically says the same thing, and that is this is a good program. This is a program that is absolutely vital, that the worst thing we can do is to cut it or to put more work requirements or more other hoops for people to have to jump through, into the law. That we should talk about expanding the benefit because a lot of the people on the benefit end up at food banks at the end of the month because it doesn't last enough. The charities can't do it alone. We went through a hearing on that somehow charities can pick up everything on their own and we don't have to have a SNAP program. That was debunked. So every single hearing has kind of reinforced what those of us who think that this program, is good, have been saying. But the problem is that there is a disconnect between the narrative in Congress and the reality. And if you listen to the debates, it seems that rather than trying to find ways to help get people out of poverty, we blame poor people. The debates are always about denigrating poor people, about diminishing their struggle. We hear all the time, if only people worked. Well, the reality is when it comes to the SNAP program, the majority of people on the benefit are children, are senior citizens, are people who are disabled. Of those who can work, the majority work. So there are people out there working and still earning so little that they qualify for the benefit. We're told that SNAP is a lifetime of dependency. Well, the median family time on SNAP is about 12 months. That's not a lifetime. We're told that the rolls are exploding. Well, as the economy is getting better, we're seeing millions of people coming off the rolls. It's actually working. In times of tough economic crisis, we have this safety net to help people. When things get better, then people gradually go off the program. We're even told that people on public assistance are more likely to use drugs. So we have a new bill out now that somebody wants to drug test everybody on SNAP. I told Roger Altman that if we get that to the floor, I'm going to introduce a bill to make sure that all members of Congress are drug tested, because that might explain why we're having this debate. It might explain a whole bunch of other debates that we're having in Congress. But the reality is it's all about being punitive. And the reality is we ought to be figuring out a way to make sure people in this country have enough to eat. That's what SNAP is all about. We have a hunger problem in this country, and it costs us enormously in a whole bunch of areas, avoidable medical costs. Children who go to school hungry have a more difficult time learning. Pregnant mothers who go without food on a regular basis, or senior citizens who take their pills on an empty stomach when it says take it with a meal because they're trying to decide how to, whether pay for their prescriptions or their food. I mean, this is a big deal, and I think the response that you're seeing in the Congress, quite frankly, ignores the reality. I'll just say one final thing. While I am happy that Speaker Ryan is talking about poverty, I am very suspect of this whole effort, and we have to be very, very careful that we always read the fine print. If you really care about poverty, and if you really have been listening to these hearings we've had in the Agriculture Committee, you wouldn't be talking about block granting the SNAP program. And by the way, in addition to block granting, they're now talking about removing the ability for states to ask for waivers for able-bodied adults without dependents who somehow can't find a job. And by the way, of that population, these so-called ABOBs, we have a lot of veterans who are in that population. Veterans who are struggling to try to reintegrate back into their communities. We have people who are looking for work that can't find one. We have people that are trying to get into job training programs, but all the job training slots have been filled. So if somebody could explain to me that you're more likely to get a job if you're hungry, I'm all ears. But I think it's a rotten thing to do to people who are struggling. And so, and I'll just say this: the evidence is there. I mean, many of the people in this room have done some remarkable research on this and have talked about the importance of this program. The problem is the politics. And I would just suggest that when we come out with these papers, you ought to release them in front of the offices of people who are talking about block granting and cutting the program. I was at a conference in New York City about hunger as a health issue, and everybody was talking about all these great reports. I said, great, let me tell you whose office you ought to go in front of and, and actually announce this. Because I think we need to put the pressure on people to help change the direction of the debate in Washington. And I think it's doable. That gives me hope we can do that. I think you can change things. But right now, we're in a very, very difficult uphill struggle.
I'll look for that list of people. We'll start storming.
I have it.
Okay, excellent, excellent.
And their cell phones.
Great, we'll tweet those out. So one thing I was struck by is it does sound to me like on the panel there's a broad agreement that the shift 20 years ago to making the safety net primarily focused on work was a good shift. I guess the question is that true? And then following on to that, is it a correct assumption that today everybody who can work can find a job? And if not, then what do we need to do today to change the safety net? And I could add another question, which is, if Jim's proposals were enacted, he's calling for a 20% increase in SNAP benefits to better align with realities of food preparation. How would that impact work activity? So sort of a mouthful all about work.
So
Please.
I would say job at the minimum wage, you are much better off today with the work-based safety net, expanded earned income tax credit, Affordable Care Act, SNAP, more child care subsidies. So, and I think that's sort of what Bob was alluding to. There's been an increase in inequality among the group of people who would have been on welfare. So I wouldn't sell short that aspect of welfare reform. It's that the group at the bottom has done worse. Luke Schaefer and Kathy Eden have a combination of SIP data and interviews, and I remember everybody laughed and said, oh, Senator Moynihan was wrong when he said there'll be 1 million people sleeping on grates. They may not all be sleeping on grates, but in the Eden Schaefer, there is probably about 1 million kids who they are saying are living on $2 a day more than was the case before. So I think that's an important point to make. Nobody in the welfare area, and Hillary and Marianne didn't say we should go back to the AFDC entitlement. So I think the issue is, what do you do about those people for whom the program doesn't work in a recession, and it doesn't work if you look for work and can't find an employer who wants to hire you even in the best of times.
So 2 quick things to add to that. One is, let us not get lost in all of this, that the earned income tax credit was a big part. We don't have the experiment of what would have happened with welfare reform in the absence of the earned income tax credit also happening at the same time. But all work that kind of tries to drill down to assess between the strong economy, welfare reform, and the expansion of the earned income tax credit, what explains the dramatic change in circumstances between 1995 and 2000, certainly all 3 played role. So that, I think it's an important thing to not forget in this discussion. But I totally agree with Sheldon and some different evidence that kind of echoes the diagnosis of the problem, not the solution, which perhaps we can also make sure we spend time talking about, is the fact that not only with Eden and Schaefer's calculations of the rise in the number of families that are living in deep poverty, in work that Marian Bittler and I have done, we've also shown that in the Great Recession, there was a substantial increase in deep poverty, that is the share of households with income below 50% of the poverty line, and that increase was much higher than we would have expected from the sort of prior well-estimated structural relationship between recessions and the cyclicality of poverty. So people with incomes around 100% of poverty seem to move in the way that history would have told us it would have. Yet there's this real strong finding at the very bottom that that group was much harder hurt in the increase in employment in the Great Recession, in a way that has a very tight line drawn to the absence of a safety net at the bottom, which is the absence of TANF.
Bob?
Yeah, I would say over the last several decades, as a whole, we've substantially strengthened the work-based part of the safety net, and we've significantly weakened the safety net for people without earnings. That doesn't mean that everything that needs to be done on the work-based safety net side has been done, and a thing that continues to stand out is that in the 20 or so states that have not taken the Affordable Care Act's Medicaid expansion, parents who are working lose eligibility for Medicaid in the typical one of those 20 states when their earnings reach something like 45 or 50% of the poverty line. If they can't get coverage through their employer and they have a medical condition, they harm themselves by working more. On the TANF front, and in terms of people at the bottom, the Bittler and Hines paper really does an excellent job of digging into the shortcomings of TANF in responding to recessions and as a safety net. I would argue that TANF has also been more disappointing than is widely understood in its relationship with work, particularly for people at the bottom who don't have jobs and who have barriers to employment. So today, only 8% of federal and state TANF funds go for employment activities. If you add in childcare, it's 24%. It's still small, and we have very rigid requirements on what counts as work. So the program does not do a very good job of providing for people with the most serious problems and barriers to employment the kind of assistance they might need to gradually help them actually make it in the labor market. And finally, and I think this is discussed in some of the papers, Sheldon has mentioned it, we really ought to explore, this brings the safety net and work base together, we really ought to explore doing more with subsidized jobs for people who even in a good economy nobody hires, to at least get the job experience and some of the on-the-job skills. We had a very successful experiment with that in 2009-10 when the subsidized jobs part of the TANF Emergency Fund led to states, Republican and Democratic alike, creating about 250,000 job slots for low-income parents and youth, and then it ended. And there is some bipartisan support for resurrecting that, at least as a demonstration project. I think that really is something we should pursue.
Jim?
Yeah, I'd like to just underscore, emphasize a couple of points. One, the work-based safety net works well for those people who are work-ready, right? And so it's pretty clear that looking at the research on TANF and the years after welfare reform, that those households that did best after welfare reform were those households that had the skills, right, that prepared them in advance for the more work-based emphasis. And so at the time, there was a lot of discussion at the state level between work-first emphasis versus human capital development. And at the time, the work-first motto won the debate. But I think looking back 2 decades now, we underinvested on the human capital development front. And so this is where I think SNAP turned out to be kind of the crucial program that kept the bottom from falling out completely for many of these families that weren't work-ready.
So I've got a bunch of follow-up questions. The one, just piling on that, if SNAP is doing as well as it is, which we think it's doing very well, do we actually need to reform TANF, or can SNAP absorb all of this? It's basically been functioning that way now.
Well, if you raise the SNAP benefit, and you let people spend it on food, clothing, and shelter, then you wouldn't need a
Okay,
TANF
that's a bit
program.
of a, that's right, okay, that's a
key
lot of
thing.
change.
That's the key thing, because SNAP is designed for food assistance. TANF is general cash, in theory, general cash. In the old AFTC programs, more cash to be used on a variety of goods and services beyond food. And that really is a key difference. You can't have a targeted program. Actually, drawing on your work with Hillary, right? Today, there's 20% of the SNAP caseload report no other cash income, right? So that means, how are they paying for housing, and things like that. And so we need these other programs in addition.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting, where people from differing perspectives can look at the same facts and draw diametrically opposed policy conclusions. So as Jim just mentioned, there's been a significant increase with the semi-disappearance of TANF as a cash safety net. There's understandably been an increase in the number of families on SNAP that have neither earnings nor cash assistance through TANF. People like myself, and maybe those of us on the panel, look at this and say, and read the $2 a Day book by Eden and Schaefer, and say we really need to do better for people at the bottom. Lots of Jim's colleagues look at this and say, my God, there has been an increase in the number of people on SNAP who don't have earnings or cash assistance. It's undercutting welfare reform and undermining work. We have to change this by making SNAP like TANF. But people look at the same data and draw diametrically opposed policy conclusions. One other point, I think that the policy recommendations in both papers are really excellent. There's one policy recommendation of Jim's that I don't agree with, and it kind of relates to the discussion we're having now, and that's to move from a national benefit structure to a regionally varied benefit structure in SNAP. And he's absolutely right that food prices vary by region. But because the cash safety net is so weak and SNAP helps substitute, the places where food prices tend to be a little lower have much lower cash welfare assistance, lower wages. And so I kind of like having the national benefit structure help fill in the gap. And I'm also would be worried, this isn't an analytic point, it's a political point. I'd be worried politically because if you varied the SNAP benefit by food prices across the country, you'd generally be increasing benefits in bluer states and reducing them in some redder states, including a lot of the states on the ag committees that are not urban. I just don't think for the political health of the program that would be good. I do think there's something really valuable in having a national income floor and a national benefit structure in SNAP. It's the only program that has that. And while I totally agree with Jim's analysis on food prices, I wouldn't want to lose the national benefit structure.
And if I can say, look at, but and this discussion we're having here, we're not having in the Agriculture Committee. We're not having in the Congress. I mean, and kind of the immediate concern is like do no harm, because there are a lot of proposals that are being put forth that would actually make things much more difficult for the people we're all talking about here. I mean, we ought to be talking about raising the minimum wage so that it's a livable wage, so that people when work pays, and there are a lot of businesses out there, a lot of corporations out there that pay their workers at minimum wage levels that could afford to pay a much better wage that we end up subsidizing, through these other programs because they don't want to pay a livable wage. But that's where the debate. Some of the things we're talking about here was where the debate ought to go. But right now, I mean, the proposals are not only bad; they keep on getting worse. The Republicans can't pass a budget, and so they want to reopen the Farm Bill, which they promised they wouldn't do, to go after SNAP even more, to take away states' abilities to ask for waivers for people who can't find jobs, who can't get into job training programs. So, I mean, the immediate concern is to remind people that this is a worthwhile benefit, that people not only depend on it, quite frankly, I don't know how you could survive without it, some of the families. And look, we have some serious issues to deal with about whether our safety net is working well enough. I spent a night in a family homeless shelter in Worcester, Massachusetts, where I live, and all the adults worked who were in this homeless shelter. Issues of affordable housing and the down payments and the security deposits and everything else. I mean, there are lots of issues that we need to resolve to kind of better deal with the issue of poverty. But for heaven's sake, let's not cut food benefits for people who are struggling and trying to put food on the table for their families.
I have lots of great questions from the audience. I'm not going to have a chance to ask them all, but I'll ask sort of a combo of two of them. They want more to understand more about what the economic consequences would be of proposals to block grant SNAP, and then also what are some of the levers that the federal government has over states to monitor and manage block granted funding. I think that there were a lot of people who are quite surprised by this TANF block grant variabilities. Do you want to talk a little bit about what kind of policy levers you think we have?
Well, I think one thing that, quite honestly, I'll have to admit, I kind of hadn't realized just what the state was until I really dove into the numbers in preparing this paper, that given the flexibility that states had, so it's one thing to block grant, that's one policy. You block grant it in nominal terms, that's a kind of straightforward calculation of the implication of that in real terms. But quite separate from that is when you block grant a program, and there's a lot of flexibility on how those block grant funds are used, you end up in situations that we have in TANF now where states are essentially using the block grant for a wide range of activities that are complying with the law that says that it has to help needy families, but there's not much definition of what needy is. And so there are many utilizations that I think we could all support as worthy expenditures, like state earned income tax credit programs, but they're not out-of-work assistance programs. And so quite separate from the value of that spending, the block grant just gets displaced to a wide range of uses that are very far from the original intent of the program.
And if I could pick up on what the congressman said, there would be a tendency in the states, Bob said something similar, to divert them toward the working poor who have a better perception than the non-working poor. So I think, this goes way back to the war on poverty and why the Johnson administration wanted to federalize all of this. But I think it's pretty clear if you block grant food stamps, particularly in states that have shown they don't want the Affordable Care Act, they have very low benefits, and they don't spend it on TANF, that money is going to flow into other approved uses, and any use that's approved that's not cash or not food stamps, that's where it's going to go.
I'd add that despite even when there are the best intentions at the federal level to write block grant legislation to avoid supplantation, it occurs, by which I mean take TANF. There's such a broad array of uses the money can go for that states have been able to substitute some of the TANF funds for state funds they were previously spending on certain services that covered low-income families. And you can't totally do it. There are some maintenance of effort requirements, but to some degree, a state that really wants to do it can substitute some of the federal money for state money, withdraw the state money, and use it anywhere else in its budget. It doesn't have to be on low-income people. So given that states, unlike the feds, have to balance their budgets every year, and they're often under intense political pressure to get that budget together that balances, it can be a strong temptation to use some of the block grant funds in ways that substitute and help you plug holes in your budget. Needless to say, SNAP responds automatically in recessions and block grants don't. It's a fixed amount of money. You lose the countercyclical response. So
Which we saw was so critical.
Right.
I mean, so critical in the Great Recession.
Still a couple more questions. I think I'll end with this one. I think people wanted more than just storming congressmen's offices. With the upcoming Ryan
That
policy
was a good idea.
proposal, what other tactics do you suggest to promote the benefits of what's working well in our safety net?
Well, one of the things, and I've worked with many of the people in this audience, I mean, I think there are a lot of members of Congress who have never talked to anybody on SNAP, who have never been to a, food bank, who have never, seen any of these programs up close and personal. I think we need to bring them into the fold. I mean, I've talked to a lot of Republicans who I think who are moving, who understand more because of some of the interactions they've had with the constituencies. The problem is the politics gets a little bit difficult. And let's just be honest here. I mean, if you hire a political consultant and you're going to run for Congress, they're not going to tell you, emphasize the campaign based on helping poor people. There's for a lot of members, even who kind of get it, they don't see the advantage, of kind of tackling some of these issues or explaining the inaccuracies. I mean, I was on a radio show just the other day, and the call I got was that every undocumented immigrant in the United States is on SNAP. I said, absolutely false, absolutely false. I read it on the internet, so he thought it had to be true. But the point of the matter is, there's so much misinformation out there about the effectiveness of these programs. They work. They can work better if we don't screw them up and shortchange them. And one final thing, I mean, I've been advocating for a long time, and my good friend Undersecretary Kincannon's here, but he can attest to this. I think the White House needs to be much more bold on tackling these issues of poverty in the United States. On the issue of SNAP, I've asked for a White House conference on food, nutrition, and hunger. We ought to be able to weave together a holistic plan, to actually, not just manage hunger, but eliminate hunger in this country. But the White House is the biggest bully pulpit we have. And we have some really brilliant people in this country who get some good ideas. We have examples of success stories all over the country we ought to bring together and replicate. And we have a lot to be proud of in the programs that we're talking about here today, that we need to remind people how they work and how we shouldn't shortchange them.
With that, I think we need to stop. Join me in thanking this terrific panel. Very fortunate.